Hey everybody. In this presentation, we are going to be talking about spice, also known as K2, and what it's made up of, synthetic cannabinoids. As you see on the upper right corner, this is fake pot, and it has very real consequences. It is very little in common with marijuana, and is widely available due to its mostly legal status. As you can see on the bottom left corner of the slide, it can be obtained in bright packets and has very interesting branding. Hello Kitty, Angry Birds, Godfather themed, etc. There are hundreds of different brands, but for the purpose of simplicity, we will just be referring to it as spice or K2, or in general, synthetic cannabinoids. K2 and spice have been making their rounds in the media, from the LA Times, NBC, CNN. All of these articles are from just the past year, and although we have known about synthetic marijuana's existence for quite a while now, recent strains have caused widespread overdoses and widespread concern. Spice first became available in 2008, and as you can see on the graph on the left-hand side of the slide, exposure to it experienced a decrease for a while after 2012 until 2015, when exposure more than tripled. And this is just looking at reports to poison control centers. Looking at ER visits, we see a huge number of cases. In 2010, there were 11,406 ER visits related to synthetic cannabinoid use, and one-third of these cases were adolescents from age 12 to 17. 75% of those cases were from age 12 to 29. In the first month of 2017, we can see on the right side of this slide, at that map, that there were already a huge number of calls to poison control centers, around 100 calls in just the month of January. So going back to the graph on the left though, so we see that slight lull in data after 2012, and then a rapid peak, 2015. Why is that? Here, we see the Synthetic Drug Abuse Prevention Act of 2012. This was passed after authorities noticed the rapid rise of ER visits, and that became alarming to them. Prior to this law, herbal incenses and potpourri were being sold with these substances in stores and online. This law made it harder for manufacturers and sellers, and that's probably why we saw a slowing down of calls to poison centers after 2012 for just a little bit of time, as we saw on the previous slide. However, drug developers have continued to stay ahead of the curve and have simply continued to make changes to the chemical formulas and created technically legal substances. It continues to be a problem, and locally it has been a huge problem on Skid Row due to its availability and affordability. Just this past September, Governor Jerry Brown signed legislation that added several other substances onto the growing list of banned synthetic cannabinoids and outlawed the possession of synthetic cannabinoids. In this slide, you see a picture of two men lying on the ground. They have overdosed from spice. And so this is a picture that is in Brooklyn, New York, and this happened in the past summer in July. Over the course of 3 days in July, there were over 130 people being treated for K2 overdose, with 33 being admitted to the hospital from the same street on the same day. Clearly, the strain that was being sold was extremely potent and was distributed within that area. The prevalence of this widespread usage and availability stems back to the nature of this drug. It's hard to regulate because we might know how some of these substances work, but they are often created in makeshift manufacturing centers in Asia, and mistakes happen due to inappropriate chemistry knowledge, unsterile conditions, etc. It's for that reason why the effects of synthetic cannabinoids are different from batch to batch, and some are stronger than others. So what exactly are K2 and spice? K2 and spice are brand names for synthetic marijuana. They were the first brands to be sold. However, there are many other names for it. There's Kush, there's Magic Mountain, there's tons of other names for it. They are sold as herbal incense and potpourri, so they are legal. They're made up of dried natural herbs that look like marijuana, but they are sprayed with synthetic cannabinoids, and they're in the new psychoactive drugs category. Just by a simple search online, I found tons of websites selling this herbal incense, known as a legal high, essentially. They are often labeled as all natural, but they are sprayed with these synthetic cannabinoids. The bags also say not for consumption, but it is most often smoked. You can see on the bottom right screenshot of this website, there are tons of different types of incenses available, and it says it's perfectly legal, but most likely sprayed with a very dangerous synthetic cannabinoid. The history of synthetic cannabinoids is relatively short. They were first developed in the 1980s for scientific research purposes. They were named the CP, HU, and JWH compounds. JWH18 and several other compounds in that family were named after John W. Huffman, professor at Clemson University. And these became important when German manufacturers began making spice from his compounds by spraying plant leaves with JWH18. And so that was the beginning of the spice outbreak that we see today. This slide shows you the different structures of JWH compounds and, for comparison's sake, THC. You can see that JWH and THC structures are pretty different, but the JWH compounds actually bind CB1 and CB2 receptors much better. THC is a partial agonist, but synthetic cannabinoids are much stronger full agonists at both CB1 and CB2. Most of the research that I looked at focuses on JWH18, but there has been a lot of research being conducted on the different types of categories of synthetic cannabinoids, such as the HU and CP cannabinoids that we looked at, or even some newer compounds. On the left-hand side of the slide, we have the specific binding of several different agonists. We see CP, which is a full agonist, JWH18, and THC, which is a partial agonist. We also have M1 through M5, which are monohydroxylated derivatives of JWH18. These researchers wanted to determine why the effects of synthetic cannabinoids were so different to those of THC. So in this study, they hypothesized that the partial to full agonism retainment in monohydroxylated derivatives leads to the toxicity, not the fact that it was a full agonist. Indeed, it shows that even as the compound is degraded, it still retains much of that agonism. You can see in the right graph that because lower Ki means higher affinity, the synthetic cannabinoids all have higher affinities. Another study showed that it was the longer the carbon chain on the indole group, so that's the aromatic group with the nitrogen, of the compound, the higher the affinity of the agonist to the receptor. Newer generation synthetic cannabinoids are becoming even stronger. The graph on the left shows stimulation of rat cortical membranes involving several different synthetic cannabinoids. Third generation synthetic cannabinoids which are included in this, such as 5-FPB22 and BB22, are shown to be much more stimulatory to the cortical membrane than even JWH18. And so further studies showed that they retain greater CB1 receptor agonist potency and efficacy and a higher binding affinity at CB1 receptors compared to JWH18. So you can see on the chemical structures of these that they too have these indole groups that I mentioned earlier, which are most likely the reason for the strong binding. If someone smokes spice, they will experience the intended effects of marijuana, such as elevated mood and euphoria, but because this drug is much more potent, the effects that they experience will be much more severe. They might experience rapid heartbeat, poor coordination, symptoms of psychosis, including hallucinations and paranoia. And so these effects will result in the appearance that you see in these images of a kind of a zombie apocalypse of people lying around and walking around aimlessly. Severe side effects might include violent behavior, vomiting, suicidal thoughts, seizure, and overdose. Overdose may occur with synthetic cannabinoids, unlike with THC, and it might lead to death. And every time someone smokes spice, they're not sure what they're going to get or what the effects are going to be because you don't know what's inside. So every time one smokes spice, it's basically playing the lottery and seeing what you get. Withdrawal from spice addiction includes paranoia, sweats, intense cravings, restlessness, diarrhea, and nausea. And some users that have previously been addicted to harder drugs, such as heroin or cocaine, have complained that quitting spice was harder for them than quitting those hard drugs. And that might be because we don't really know what's inside of spice and its mixture. And spice sometimes contains synthetic opioids, which might explain the overdose and deaths that we see in some people. In the future, some solutions to this growing epidemic might include more law involvement, so the banning of new substances, or perhaps the total ban of herbal incense and potpourri, which we see in some states and many countries in Europe. Most importantly, though, the public must be educated that although some of these substances might be legal, they are very unsafe and unpredictable. So, thank you.